Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's production of The Language of Thieves with Martin Puchner. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the curator of programming at Planet Word. And if you are already a member of Planet Word or a supporter of the museum, thank you so much for that. That's how we're able to keep admission free to the museum and bring you guests like tonight. If you heard about this program through some other means, a friend sent you the link, or you follow Professor Puchner elsewhere, we encourage you to go to our website, planetwordmuseum.org, see all of our upcoming programming. Come visit us if you can. We are in the historic Franklin School at the corner of 13th and K in downtown DC. That's it in my Zoom background. And we are open Thursday through Sunday, 10 to 5, but we do have some extra holiday hours coming up for Christmas week and New Year's week. So head to the website, see when our open hours are coming up. I'm going to turn this over to our guest. Martin Puchner is a professor of English and comparative literature at Harvard. His book is called The Language of Thieves: My Family's Obsession with a Secret Code the Nazis Tried to Eliminate. Dr. Puchner, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me. Thank you all for attending. And I have to say, I can't wait to visit the museum. It sounds so great in the background there. So congratulations on opening that during the COVID crisis. Must be quite a feat. I'll talk about today about a strange and rather obscure language that's often called or considered a language of thieves, or a language of vagrants. It's sometimes called a language of beggars. I think of it as a language of the road. And I'm going to give you a sense of that very funny and moving and interesting language. But I want to start by saying that I did not come to this language as a scholar. I came to this language as a child. So for me, it's also a personal story. And that's what I want to talk to you about as well. In fact, some of my earliest childhood memories are connected to this language, or rather the world of these vagrants who spoke it. And even though Root-Welsh itself was almost exclusively a spoken language, there were written signs associated with it as well. Signs that looked a little bit like that you would find on fences or on foundation stones of houses, and that would give those who knew how to read them important information. So this is not an image of my childhood home, but as I mentioned, one of my earliest memories is vagrants showing up at our house, asking for water and something to eat, and my mother would give them that. And this kept happening every couple of weeks with some frequency. And at some point, my mother started to wonder, why are these people coming to our house and not to any of our neighbors? And at some point, my uncle visited and he saw a sign like that. And he said, that's a sign that says to vagrants who know how to read these signs, there's something, there's food to be had there. So all of this took place in Germany in the 1970s, where I was growing up in Germany. But after I moved to the United States and watched, like maybe some of you did, the series Mad Men, I was surprised to see that some of these signs that I associate with this language, Root-Welsh, had made it to America. So this is a screenshot from Mad Men. It's from the first season when Don Draper, the protagonist, there's a flashback to his childhood. He's growing up on a farm in the Great Depression, and a farm owned by his evil stepdad. And a hobo comes by, works for a day in exchange for a quarter and a night and a place to sleep at night. But next morning finds out that Don Draper's stepdad is cheating him, not giving him the quarter. So young Don Draper follows the hobo to the periphery of the property and watches him carve the sign, which means a dishonest man lives here. And I immediately recognized the sign. This was the sign that German hobos had been using for hundreds of years. So that was this sort of repertoire of sign, about 40 or 50 signs like that. And I was, as I mentioned, introduced to that to that sign system as a child by my uncle who knew it. And there are different kinds of signs like this: a dishonest man warning people, a kind of a W that looked like fletched teeth was a sign that this warning of an aggressive dog. There are signs warning vagrants away from certain places because they're aggressive policemen. A cross, it's one of my favorite, a cross meant that you have to act pious in order to get a handout, and so on and so forth. So those were the signs. There were sometimes even more complicated signs like this, which meant that a vagrant who went by the initials M and H came by here in 1832 in the company of the two vertical strokes means two men, is a group composed of two men, and the three O's can mean women or children. So a whole group of 5 people came by and walked in the direction of this arrow. So sometimes these signs became quite elaborate and almost, in a sense, told a little story. These signs were called Zinken, which comes from the Latin word for signum. So that was, in a sense, my initial introduction to this world of vagrants and the fact that they had secret signs. Later, I learned that it wasn't just signs, but that there was a whole secret language that they spoke. And this too is something that I was introduced to by my uncle. And as a child, I loved these words. They seemed very funny and earthy to me. So for example, a stinker was a barn, a woodworm was a carpenter. So it's clear, it seemed to me that these vagrants had sort of taken words and changed their meanings and turned it into almost into a secret language. But it wasn't just everyday words like those. So this, for example, is how I was introduced to Shakespeare. This is from Romeo and Juliet, Dear Romeo, or Swear not by the moon, the constant moon that monthly changes in her circle orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable. Only I wasn't introduced to Shakespeare like that. I was introduced to Shakespeare by my uncle like this. Hippiger Romeo, o gable lau beim Bleck dem Überbeuter, der Merwig seinen Radling wahret, damit den Rauch dein Lenzen waverbar. Okay, so what is this? This is Rotwelsch, this language. And the passage gives you a little bit of a sense of how it works. As you can see, perhaps that's the grammar is mostly German grammar. But most of the meaning-bearing words, the lexicon, comes from all different kinds of languages. So Hippiger comes from Chiba, the Yiddish and Hebrew word for love, so dear Romeo. Gable is one of my favorite, comes from German. Gabel is the noun for fork. Only here it doesn't mean fork, it's a verb. It doesn't mean to fork over or something like that, or eat with a fork. It means to swear, because when you swear, you hold up your fingers like prongs of a fork. Black comes from German and Yiddish for tin, Blech, can also mean coin. Only here it doesn't mean coin, but it means moon. So the piece of coin that's hanging in the sky. So I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of how this language works. So it uses Yiddish, Hebrew, German, Yiddish again. Black can also be from Czech. And other languages, and draws on these languages, incorporates them, and often changes their meaning, as with Gable and Black. So this translation of Shakespeare comes from my uncle. And so he was the key figure in teaching me this language. He spent his life obsessed with Rotwelsch. He created an archive, hundreds of words, dictionaries of this language. He collected books and sources on their speakers. And he actually managed to publish some of these translations, including the Shakespeare translation I just gave you. So this was my introduction to Rotwelsch through this uncle. He was not a vagrant. He had just sort of come across it. He was a writer, a poet, and had come across his language and fallen in love with it, and then spent his life trying to rescue it from oblivion. He died very early of a brain aneurysm, and I inherited this archive and in a sense have been carrying it around with me for 25 years and always thought at some point I have to do something with it. And so this book, The Language of Thieves, is in a way the result of that. But that's not all, because there, by mere chance, I realized why my uncle was so obsessed with this language, and that's a slightly complicated story. A story that starts in this wonderful reading room of Widener Library at Harvard, where I was a graduate student. And like all graduate students, I was sitting late in this library procrastinating when I thought, people have always bragging about how great Widener Library is. It's one of the greatest libraries in the world. So I thought, let me see whether they have my uncle's Rotwelsch books, like the ones I just showed you. And lo and behold, they did. And I was amazed that this obscure publication had made it all the way across the Atlantic. But then I got bolder and I thought, okay, let me test this library again. And I thought, why not look up my grandfather, a historian of names, an occupation that always seemed to me very obscure. And again, I went deep into the bowels of the library and found all kinds of publications by him, very dry stuff in some ways, about the place names in certain corners of southern Germany during the Middle Ages, things like that. But among those, I also found an article called Family Names as Racial Markers. It was a kind of a strange article, a strange name. I saw that was from a title. It was from 1934. And I started reading and it was more and more disoriented and shocked because what I was reading was an incredible anti-Semitic rant that was all about how there were German-sounding Jewish names and Jewish-sounding German names, and it was very hard to keep them apart. And this was a big mess. And he recommended that Jews not be allowed to change their names and assume German names. And he recommended that there should be an inventory of Jewish names, and that experts like him, experts in the history of names, should be drawn upon to clear up this mess so that you could tell who was Jewish and who was not. It's really shocking stuff. In the middle of the shock, there's also a puzzle, because in the middle of this terrible rant, my grandfather, Dr. Karl Puchner, writes about Rotwelsch, this language of the road, and he's nothing good to say about it. For him, it's a proof that because there's Yiddish and Hebrew in this underground language, that all Jews are criminals. He thinks it is polluting German, and he wants the language eliminated. So in addition to this shocking revelation about clearly my grandfather's anti-Semitic past during the Nazi era, was this puzzle how it could be that my grandfather clearly hated this language, and how my uncle at some point had decided to make it his life's mission to rescue it from oblivion. So this, in a sense, sent me on sort of two related research projects, one into the history of my family, especially my grandfather, and a history of this language. Because I realized that even though I had sort of grown up around it, I knew next to nothing about its history. I didn't know whether my grandfather was right that it was a Jewish language and connected to Jewish criminals, as he claimed. I didn't know its history. I didn't know anything about its speaker. So I decided to study it more systematically. To my surprise, I found that the language was very old, hundreds of years old, going back to the Middle Ages, and that one of the first written sources was by Martin Luther. He published a book called Liber Vagatorum, a book of vagrants, where he warned his readers of different tricks beggars use to swindle you out of your money. And at the end, he added a list of about 200 words in Rood Welsh, so that you could also understand the language of these vagrant beggars, so they can't trick you. So it was a book, one of the first written sources, a book written against this language. But it was from Martin Luther that I also learned the meaning of the word Rood Welsh. So Rood comes from beggar in Rood Welsh, in that language. And Welsh can mean foreign, it can mean Italian, associated with Italy. But in this context, it means incomprehensible. So Rood Welsh, the incomprehensible language of beggars. That's the most common term. So already quite negative. There's another word that's less common, but that I like better. And this word is clearly from the outside, from those who are not initiates, who don't speak Rood Welsh, to whom it is incomprehensible. The other word for the language, Coghermoloshan, is the opposite. It's from the inside. It's based on Hebrew. Coghermer for wise, to know. Loshan is the Hebrew word for tongue or language. So the language of those in the know, the language of the wise guys, so to speak. Now, from this archive on Rood Welsh and its speakers, I inherited, there are a couple of figures that I became kind of intrigued by, and I just want to mention them very briefly. One was called Constanzer Hans. He was a kind of Robin Hood figure because he mostly stole from the rich. But he was a Rood Welsh speaker, and when he got arrested by the police, which he did frequently, the police would start to be interested in the language. So whenever they arrested someone like Constanzer Hans, they would force them to divulge words from Rood Welsh. And so this means that basically the entire written archive of Rood Welsh, except for those signs I started with, is an archive essentially compiled by the police in different precincts and by people like Martin Luther, who were also skeptical or hostile to this language. The same is true of another figure from the 19th century, another vagrant, a former cobbler's apprentice who started to fight with his masters and then sort of drifted into the world of Rood Welsh speakers. And when he was arrested, and this was mostly in Bohemia, but finally he crossed over into Eastern Germany and was arrested in Jena. And again, the police realized, oh, here we have a Rood Welsh speaker, let's get some words out of him in this language, and forced him to divulge words again. But they realized that they were particularly lucky because here was a Rood Welsh speaker who actually knew how to read and write, something somewhat unusual for that milieu. In part because Ferdinand Bamhauer had his expertise, his niche in the ecosystem of the underground was to forge documents. So what the police did, they sat him down and made him write scenes. He produced over 100 pages of life in the underground in Rood Welsh. So this is the only real written source written by a Rood Welsh speaker in Rood Welsh. On the left hand is German, the right hand is the translation, and he even added footnotes. It's a strange document because it's produced under duress for the police, but somehow Bamhauer really got into it and started to almost write these texts as plays with stage direction and explanations and translations and footnotes, a fascinating source. The third figure I want to briefly mention is someone called Gregor Gog. You can see we are now in the early 20th century. And he tried to organize vagrants, mostly again in Germany, but also to some extent internationally. And because of this, he was sometimes called the king of the tramps. He also started a newspaper in a way the predecessor of homeless newspapers, newspapers written and produced by homeless people, called the Vagrant, in which vagrants would write about their own life experiences, mostly in German, but they would sometimes talk about the language and include dialogues about their language. This in the 20th century is also the culmination of a history of persecution of Rotwelsch speakers, which starts with Martin Luther and all the policemen I mentioned, and now culminates with the Nazis. Vagrants were among the first to be thrown into concentration camps, including Gregor Gog. He managed to escape into the Soviet Union, where he died at the end of 1945 of an illness. So this history of prosecution runs through the entire history of Rotwelsch and the written archive of Rotwelsch. So in that sense, my grandfather was no exception. He's part of that history. But it was also in the 20th century that writers started to get interested in this language. So in that sense, my uncle, with his Rotwelsch translations, and he also incorporated Rotwelsch words into his poetry, was not quite alone. And the most well-known of those was Franz Kafka. He wrote in German, but he was very interested in Yiddish and recognized the close connection between Yiddish and Rotwelsch. And therefore, he fell in love with a troupe of Yiddish players and developed a little lecture he would give to, mostly addressed to the German bourgeois, the German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie of Prague, convincing them to go to Yiddish theater. In the course of describing Yiddish, he also briefly talks about Rotwelsch and sees it as sort of an interesting resource. Rotwelsch also sometimes pops up in the history of artificial languages because it was seen mostly by the police as this kind of secret language thieves had concocted in order to avoid detection by the police. This isn't quite true, but it's a persistent idea. And it means that sometimes Rotwelsch pops up in sort of histories of ciphers and decoding and artificial languages. And finally, it's sometimes associated with this man, Ludwig Zamenhof, the inventor of Esperanto, again, because it was seen as a secret language, but also because of the language mixtures that's true of Rotwelsch. So that's sort of the history of language in the 20th century. Now I want to close this presentation. I hope to have a conversation with you about all of this. But I want to close a loop that I started that was important for me in motivating this history of Rotwelsch, and that's that second revelation in Widener Library, namely that my own grandfather was so crucially connected to this history of Rotwelsch and its persecution under the Nazis. As I mentioned, I knew that he was a historian and archivist. So, and when I discovered this article, I immediately confronted my father with it. And my father, who had never spoken about my grandfather's past, admitted that he knew something that his father, my grandfather, had some connections to the Nazi Party, because he had developed this image when he was in his 30s, this image of his grandfather for a Christmas calendar, and he noticed that button on the jacket was a swastika. So he and his brother, who would become this Rotwelsch expert, confronted their father. This was in the 60s. And became a big fight. But then, intriguingly or interestingly or disturbingly, that confrontation somehow was spurred again. And neither my father nor my uncle nor my grandfather ever spoke of it again, which is why I never knew of this past. So it's how this book became not just a book about a secret language, but in a sense also a book about this family secret that was sort of discovered and then buried again, and then by chance discovered by me again. So I looked into the history of my grandfather and learned that he had become after the war, the director of the Bavarian State Archive, and the archive kept this long personnel file on him, from which I learned his entire history, including his early membership of the Nazi Party, he became a member of the stormtroopers, and even how he managed to sort of weasel his way out of denazification after the war. Very disturbing documents. But what's perhaps remarkable about it is that my grandfather knew of this personnel file. After all, it was in his own archive. He was the director of this archive. And I know exactly that he knew of this personnel archive because the last entry is after he had long retired and he'd gotten some honorary membership in some name society, history or something like that. And he sends this piece of information to the archive and says, and with a little written note that says, please add this to my personnel file so that that file is complete. It's very hard to know how to interpret this. I mean, clearly he didn't want to destroy this personnel file. He was an archivist, after all, and archivists are supposed to save documents. And so he did, even though in a sense he knew that this personnel file, anyone could have looked at it and discovered his Nazi past that he wanted to avoid. But he didn't. And so there it was, waiting until I came and looked at it. And the last piece of this family history that's maybe relevant here is that I also started to look into his brother, who my great uncle, who was also an archivist, who younger brother who followed in his older brother's footstep, who became an early member of the Nazi Party, not quite as early as his brother, and after the war had a nice career as an archivist and became the director of the Nuremberg archive, and made his career thanks to this, the Nuremberg trials, which generated a huge amount of information and documents that were collected in the Nuremberg State Archive. This is just one of many aisles of this material. And so, the irony that this former Nazi becomes one of the experts on the Nuremberg trials and charged with guarding them in this town. So this is that second story, the family history that is so strangely connected to this language. And so in the book, I'm trying to weave together those two stories, the story of Ruth Welsh and the story of my family, to end on a slightly more upbeat note, perhaps. I also include little Ruth Welsh lessons, because I too want to save this language from oblivion, like my uncle, perhaps, in that respect, whom I'm convinced studied Ruth Welsh and devoted his life to it as a kind of atonement for his father. And the book also ends. When I started the book, I thought this was that there were no living speakers of this language anymore, but I discovered by chance that there are, in fact, remnants of this language spoken by vagrants in the German-speaking world, in Switzerland and some other places. So amazing to me that this language that had been persecuted for many centuries, including by my own grandfather, managed to survive all of this. And so that's, I think, something to celebrate.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the book. I really do recommend it. It's called The Language of Thieves. But I know our audience has questions. We'll get to those. I have a couple. What purpose do you think Ruth Welsh served that German or Yiddish or Hebrew or Czech or Latin or any of the other things that are sort of sprinkled in didn't? Why did the people who spoke it need a separate language?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And, there's one answer. The archives gives one clear answer, and that is to avoid detection. It's a criminal secret language. But the more I thought about it, the more that just seemed to me a wrong story, because that's not how, they always imagined, like in some back room, the thieves get together and develop this language. And if we know anything, we know that that's not how languages develop. Languages develop through a very distinct lifestyle. So linguists call this a sociolect, or the language, the jargon of a milieu. And I think that's correct in that there's a very distinct lifestyle that in a sense gets expressed in this language. There are tons of words for policemen or for being arrested, and you can see in that language the life experience of its speakers. And so I think that that speaks through it. So it's the purpose in some sense is that they shared a distinct form of life. This is sort of the language theory that Wittgenstein developed, and he's a very important language philosopher for me, who basically says that a distinctive milieu will develop a distinctive language. And I think that's true. And this is why these kinds of languages, if you have a particular subgroup, it will develop in part, I would say, on the one hand, out of solidarity, to create a kind of, it's the sort of community building aspect of language. And I see that also very much in these written signs they left for each other, right? The individual person who leaves the sign, stay away from this farm, they will cheat you, it doesn't profit from it, but it's a solidarity across this milieu. And I think that's also expressed in the language. And so, yes, of course, for an outsider, it's an incomprehensible language, but that's true of all languages. We therefore don't call them secret languages. So I think it's much more the solidarity and the expression of a distinctive life than this idea, this kind of almost paranoid idea of secrecy. Now, it's true that from time to time, I'm sure being able to speak in a semi-secret way, at least, can come in handy. That's also true of any other situations in which you have access to a language. The way parents, my parents sometimes spoke French when they didn't want us to, in front of the children, when they didn't want, us to understand. And I feel like, parents have that, who have a distinct language from the children, do that. But so I came to really distrust the secrecy theory of the language, and I think came to see much more the kind of community building part of the language, if that makes sense.
It's interesting. We didn't do this on purpose, but our conversation last night was about the language of cults and about building loyalty and a sense of us versus them, in obviously a more nefarious way, but it is a basic human desire to sort of have an insider status. And it's interesting that you say that that's sort of where you settled on the purpose of root welch, because the classic definition of a sociolect, or I've also heard cryptolect, is to actually keep people out, that it's more about identifying as a shibboleth, who's not an insider, than bringing a bonding mechanism to the people who are.
And that is, I think that's very nicely put, and that certainly exists. So, at the end, the last chapter is about this group of speakers who speak a sort of successor language to Root Welsh in Switzerland that I was able to establish contact with, and they said that they clearly have a deep distrust of outsiders, anyone having to do with the state, not just the police, but the state, because of settlement programs and the hard life of any vagrant group, nomadic group within our world that's so premised on settlement. And so they say, I was only able to speak to them through an intermediary whom they trusted, but they say, for example, that when anyone comes and once an outsider is interested in their language, they actually deliberately tell them false things. And that if they feel like some word has gotten into general circulation and words from this language filtered up or down, as however one want to say it, into German, that they tended to stop using those words. So it was interesting, even though I had become skeptical of the secret language, the nevertheless the contact with this group reminded me of that deep distrust that is part of the life experience, and so it does work as a shibboleth. And there are scenes in that journal I mentioned. There is one Root Welsh speaker basically describes a scene where that testing, are you cued into this language or not? So but that's just the other side of community building, Right.
If you have to define who's in, you have to define who's out. I I wonder, just from a research point of view, because you wanted to bring some academic rigor to this, how do you go about researching a language that is largely not written down, that, as you say, is to degree that it is recorded by those who are antithetical to it, skeptical
Yes.
of it, even trying to eradicate it? And how is the way you went about studying it different than the way your Uncle Gunter did?
Yeah. No, no, I mean, it really, I halfway through, I realized this is in some ways a book about not just archivists like my grandfather, but about archives and who keeps them and what gets written down and for what purpose. So as I mentioned this, I became very skeptical of the claims the archive was making about the language. At the same time, this was the sole, basically the only source, with partial exception of that weird Baumhauer source, but that too was written for the police and at the police station. And in fact, you could imagine that Baumhauer was just telling the police what they wanted to know in order to get in good with them. And in fact, that's what he did. And they start to stop paying attention. He was able to escape again. So you could say this was all a big con or ruse. Who knows whether we can trust it, So it's shot through with that paradox. It's hostile to the language, skeptical of it, purveys wrong ideas, including, for example, that it's something I also struggled with. Is it a Jewish language, as, for example, my grandfather claimed? And not that that would be a problem, but just who were the speakers? And I came to the conclusion that actually most of the speakers were not of Jewish descent. There are some examples of that, but most of the individual biographies I was able to reconstruct, including the three I gave you, were all of Christian background, people who drifted into this milieu. So essentially, it meant reading the archive against the grain with a great degree of skepticism, but at the same time having to rely on it. And at some point, I even found myself sort of vaguely grateful for Martin Luther and all these policemen who wrote. And there are actually one or two examples. There's one example of a late 19th century policeman, very interesting figure called Ave Lallemant, who really got interested in the language. He was a policeman and wrote as a policeman, but he was also interested in police reform, an interesting figure and a novelist on the side. And he undertook the first, I would say, sort of halfway serious quasi-academic study of the language. So there's also that not all the policemen were just, terrible either, but in any case, it's what I had to rely on. And so, the ambivalence of these archivists and different kinds of archivists and people who write things down. And there's my grandfather, and then there's my uncle, who creates his own personal archive, often based on these sources from Martin Luther and the policeman and all of that, but who also, though, uses that for a very different purpose, to preserve the language, but also, I think this was his personal purpose to, in a sense, let the language loose on German. He loved the idea of this language sort of, and this is using formulations. I don't know whether he had it from Kafka or whether he just sort of came to a similar conclusion, that this would sort of rake up the language, as Kafka put it, that it would sort of estrange the language, make import these words that are sort of familiar but used differently. And he, as a poet, was really loved that idea. So that was another part. The preservation is one thing, but also he thought it was this great literary resource. Anyway, and then how do I mean, I of course identify much more with my uncle. Certainly the parts of the book that these little Root-Welsh lessons that I include, I think, are very much in the spirit of my uncle as well. And it's also true that it's very clear from reading my uncle's correspondence and in this book that he was very aware that these speakers had been persecuted, including and especially by the Nazis. But he did not tell the full story of this persecution, nor the story of his father, my grandfather. And I don't know what he actually knew about him. I don't even know whether he knew that article, for example, where his father wrote against this language. So it remained to some extent a mystery to me that that connection, but it's very clear, nevertheless, that he, for him, it was a form of atonement. And I would say to some extent, that's also true of me.
Mhm. Well, when you talk about was it spoken largely by Jewish people and was it therefore persecuted by the Nazis because of its association with Judaism, you have to talk about Yiddish, right? It's sitting right there as
But
this very Jewish form of German.
yes.
We have a question from the audience who says, I thought Yiddish was rooted in Hochdeutsch. Would you say that Rottwelsch has the same root, or is Rottwelsch an offshoot of Yiddish?
Yeah, a fascinating language. And clearly my uncle, by the way, there's a lot of Yiddish in his archive, and he made it a point of studying Yiddish because it clearly is an important language, and I did the same. And so Yiddish is actually an offshoot of Middle High German, as is Rotwelsch. I mean, that's the period in which also Rotwelsch emerges. So you could say that the three languages are, go back to Middle High German. Technically, it's that's the German before the second vowel shift. And so they all go very far back. I probably would not call it an offshoot of Yiddish, but there's a lot of Yiddish in Rotwelsch. And also whatever Hebrew is in Rotwelsch, I'm sure came via Yiddish. And the best explanation I can give for why there is so much Yiddish in Rotwelsch, even though most of the speakers were not Yiddish speakers, most of the Rotwelsch speakers were not Yiddish speakers, is that to some extent, both were languages of the road or of migration. That, of course, there was a distinct form of sort of Jewish peddlers, that sort of semi-migratory peddlers that existed. There's also the figure of the Betteljuden, the Jewish beggar, that exists. And so I think there were sort of overlaps in the life worlds of some Yiddish speakers and these Rotwelsch speakers, and that led to an exchange of words. There are also, for example, some Romani words, the language of Sinti and Roma, in Rotwelsch, for the same reason, that there's some overlap among these groups. But in the end, Rotwelsch speakers, I think I came to the conclusion that they were not religiously or ethnically defined. It was really more whoever sort of became part of this milieu would be inducted into the language and then speak it. Mm-hmm. But Yiddish is very, very central. And it's very interesting to think about the relation between Yiddish and Rotwelsch.
There is a question about the relation to Romani, which would stand to reason given the sort of nomadic nature and spreading among other cultures.
Exactly. So as far as I can tell, the influence is one way from Romani to Rotwelsch. I think in part because Romani, Sinti and Roma tended to be much more, not entirely close, but nevertheless have a sense of distinct identity, ethnic identity, frowned upon marriage outside the group, and part of the identity was a linguistic identity, of course, Romani. But there was, because Rotwelsch speakers were less of a close group and not identified via in a kind of ethnic way, I think it was much easier for Romani words to find their way into Rotwelsch than the other way around.
We have an interesting question. Someone asks, if I were to have a secret language, I would have used a form of sign language. Is there any evidence they created hand communication?
So it's true that different underground groups have created over the past hand communication. And I mean, these written signs, these Zinken, like the American hobo signs, you could say, are also, there's one elaborate Zinken I have in the book where clearly someone is sort of planning a heist, actually, and is sort of saying, let's meet here, and then we'll go and do this robbery of a church as it happens. So those Zinken, I think, sometimes had that
pictogram quality. Yeah,
exactly. But again, these these kinds of scenes and signs dominate the archive because this is what the police thought this language was being used for all the time anyway. And so I, sort of restating what I said before, I actually came away from it thinking that, yes, that exists and that use existed, but for the most part, it wasn't that. And to say this differently, but when I started this book, I thought that Root Welsh was this totally unique thing, in part because of its history, this combination of languages, the distinct use of this milieu, and in many ways it is. But I've also come, in some sense, by the end, now that I've written the book, I've actually come out at the very end that it's actually the most typical language, or that all groups develop their own ways of, from teenagers and skateboarders to, what have you. And, ever since talking about this book and its topic, so many people have written to me about distinct languages from all over the world. So having started thinking that this is a unique and special thing, I now think it sort of speaks to how languages work in general, and that yes, there are unique features here, but what's even more striking is that it is how universal in some sense it is.
Well, especially for an English speaker, right? I mean, I saw something on Twitter recently that said something about English corners other languages in back alleys and roots around in their pockets for spare grammar and vocabulary.
That's great.
So it is absolutely a language cobbled together from other
Yeah.
language traditions. In fact, it has been sort of amusing to me because I have the captions on to see what the artificial intelligence thinks we're saying when we say Root Welsh.
Oh yeah, what is it saying?
We've gotten root canal, we've gotten romance, we've gotten vegetable, and we've gotten Roosevelt. And I actually think that's sort of wonderfully on brand,
Yeah.
that it sounds like a lot of other words. Really
That's great.
keeping with the sort of cryptic and ever-changing nature of the language itself.
That's terrific. That's terrific. That's terrific.
We have someone ask, is Root Welsh ever a first language?
A fascinating language, a question, and that I've asked myself this also. So for the most part, and the question rightly implies that it seems to be a second language, like you grow up mostly as a German speaker, and then you acquire this language if you're part of this milieu. And hence also the sometimes far-fetched but interesting connection to Esperanto, which was also mostly, except in really dedicated families, a second language, and was meant as a second language, as a sort of second communicative language. So I think for the most part, I in part because of that connection, I sometimes started to think of Root Welsh as sort of the Esperanto of the underworld, because it was also at least a kind of trans-regional language, sort of spoken from the Rhine to Prague. But there were times when sort of one high tide of Root Welsh, as I can make it out, was in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. So the 30 Years' War, this unbelievably bloody and long religious war, fought primarily in Central Europe, in which all the powers, very in some sense similar of the religious wars of our time, because all foreign powers sort of it was between Catholics and Protestant to some extent, but intervened and had sort of placeholder armies on German land. So lots of displacement, lots of disruptions. And so these roving gangs, gang is maybe too negative a term, groups of homeless people, sometimes 50, 100 people. And this is the milieu or the time in which Root Welsh thrived. And there were families, and I can't imagine that at such moments that children would sort of grow up speaking it. In that one written source, the Baumhauer source that I mentioned, Baumhauer writes an interesting scene of a group of a family of Root Welsh speakers, a mother, father, two children in a kind of cart, and they're selling trinkets and escaping from the police. And there's a moment when they clearly code switch from Root Welsh, between Root Welsh and German back and forth. So it seemed that these children in some ways have access to the language. Made me think that maybe it wasn't just a second language acquired in adulthood, especially at least at certain moments. It seems plausible that people would children would grow up with it.
Somebody asks, the written symbols are very interesting. Do you know if they were created early or simultaneously with the spoken language, or did they come later?
Yeah, it's hard to know. The sources, I have much older sources on the language than on the written symbols. But that could just be a effect of what the police were writing down. Certainly, in principle, the impetus to leave signs and marks seems to me a very basic human one, and in a milieu like that, important. But these signs weren't quite recorded in the same way the words were. So Luther, for example, doesn't mention these signs. But nevertheless, it seems to me, just from what I understand about the life circumstances of these speakers, it seems to me plausible that they would sort of grow up, emerge in tandem. Because I see, and it's interesting that these symbols then clearly sort of make it across the Atlantic and get sort of repurposed by the hobos. And that just shows that they're sort of available and in different groups that need them. Back to your question about the purpose here. If you need them, you use them, or you invent them if you have to.
We have two related questions. Someone asks, did you know your grandfather? And another asks, what does your family think about your book revealing family secrets?
Yeah. So I knew my grandfather. I have very nice childhood memories of him. He died when I was 10 or 11. My family, I shared with some family members revelations I made, including the one in the mid-90s in Widener Library to my father. And that was a difficult conversation with my father after that, but it was, I thought, the start of a conversation. But tragically, my father actually died of an accident very soon thereafter. So it was, I could never really continue that conversation. And in some sense, the book is also an attempt to continue it, perhaps. Other family members reacted quite violently. Some are no longer speaking to me. They've also threatened lawsuits. So it's difficult to write about families, even if the main figures are dead. So it's been but not all others found it important, and including my aunt, the only surviving daughter of this grandfather, has been very open and interested and wonderful about it. So families are complicated. No family likes. There's a poet who said, "The family that has a writer in it, that family is finished." I hope that that's not quite the true of this book. I try to be very respectful and even-handed, but families don't like it, and I have some sympathy for that. But it's been more difficult than I would have anticipated, to tell you the truth.
Given your grandfather's role in trying to eradicate it, did you ever stop and wonder whether this was your story to tell?
I certainly, in some sense, felt it was my story to tell. Because I sort of, no one in the family was interested in Ruth Welch, and I was sort of the only one, and which is why after my uncle's death, I went to my aunt and said, I'm interested, can I have this stuff? And she gave me these boxes of material. So that, and then this revelation about my grandfather. So these were the sort of two independent sources that drove this project. And so I do feel that it was my story to tell, because it's such an obscure topic, but also because because of this archive, felt like I had a unique access to it, and because I sort of grown up around it, and because of my grandfather's role in it, maybe also, I don't want to make it sound too grandiose, but as some kind of moral obligation, perhaps, to
Redemption.
do it also.
Yeah. We are almost out of time, but somebody asked, Does anybody still speak it? Is it gone?
So yeah, I mean, I mentioned it maybe too briefly at the very end. I, for the most part, thought that it is gone, but I realized that it isn't. This happened a few years ago when an article about this research project appeared in a newspaper, a wonderful article. And so people started to write to me with sightings of this language. It's very hard to draw exact boundaries across this language, but there are certainly speakers today who still use, I would call it, successor languages that have quite a few root Welsh words in it, including that group in Switzerland I mentioned. So I've come to the conclusion that no, it is not a dead language. It's still, in some ways, in maybe distant ways, it still exists, which I find very heartening.
Well, Martin Puchner, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. It's been a delight. And thank you for writing the book.
And thank you, Rebecca, for having me. And congratulations again on this great museum. And I can't wait to visit.
Yes, let us know when you're in town. We'd be happy to help to welcome and
I will.
welcome all of the rest of you to come visit Planet Word if you haven't had a chance yet. Thank you all so much for being here. We'll see you next time.